Okay, kiddos, let's get into it. We're doing the last lesson in Unit 1. It's going to be 1.6 notes. Okay, so we're going to talk about all sorts of angle relationships today. Okay, so all of these right over here. So let's get right into it. Okay, all angle relationships. So let's first start with vertical angles. Okay, so a vertical angle. Okay, vertical angle is two angles across from each other on intersecting lines. Okay, across from each other on intersecting lines. So go ahead and draw this with me. Okay, so if we said that's one line, right, and this is another line. Okay, so those are intersecting lines. It's the two angles across from each other. So say I had this one and this one. So let's label that one with angle number 1, right, and angle number 2. Okay, so angle number 1 and angle number 2 are across from each other. They're always congruent. Okay, so we remember what congruent means. Congruent means same shape and the same size. Okay, so if it's the same size, then here's the relationship we're going to use for our equations. We're going to say this part equals the other part. Okay, so that's going to be our rule. This part equals the other part. Okay, so that's vertical angles, two angles that are across from each other using intersecting lines. Okay, keeping that in mind, let's keep it moving. All right, next, adjacent angles. Okay, so if these are vertical angles, let's draw adjacent. Two angles that are next to each other and share a common side. Okay, so say I had an angle like this, right? If I say that's angle 1, if I have another angle that shares a common side, so imagine I share this side, I'm going to draw that and put a angle there if that's 2. Okay, so these share this common side right over here, right? That's the common side that they share. So these are adjacent angles. Okay, so what we would do for this is one part, this is another part. So if we're trying to figure out the whole thing, then we would say part plus part equals whole. Okay, part plus part equals the whole thing. Okay, so that's on adjacent and vertical angles. So now let's keep it moving. So next, let's talk about complementary angles. So complementary angles are any two angles whose sum is 90. Okay, so that means they add to 90. So one way, the most common way, is when you see something like this. Okay, so if we do that, right, we know that this one is, if we do that, we know that this is 90 degrees, right? That tells us it's 90 degrees, right? So if I have, say I took a line, right, and I cut it right here, then we would have two angles, right? That would be angle number 1, and then this would be angle number 2 right over here, right? But they would add to 90 degrees. So the sum of them are 90. Now also they could be separate, right? So imagine I had this angle right here, right, like number 2, and then I had a separate angle right there, right? And if that was 1, well, if this one was, say, if I said that was 60 degrees, right? And if I said this one with two arcs is 30 degrees, then the 60 and 30 would add to 90. Okay, so complementary angles are any two angles whose sum is 90. They could be separate like this, or they could be both on the same one. Okay? Okay, so then if the sum of these angles is 90, that means whatever this part is plus this part is going to be equal to 90. Okay, so that's going to be our formula for this one. Okay, so we're going to write that down. Part plus part. Let me change that code. Part plus part equals 90. Okay, part plus part equals 90. All right, so moving right along, we've done vertical angles where we said part equals a part. We've done adjacent angles where we say part plus part equals whole. Then we've done complementary where we say part plus part equals 90 because that's the whole amount. All right, let's keep it moving. Now we're going to move on to what we say call supplementary angles. So similar to complementary, where complementaries add up to 90, supplementary angles are any two angles that add up to 180. Okay, so if the sum of those is 180, imagine that you had something like this. All right, imagine like I just drew a straight line, so go ahead and draw that. So we're just drawing a straight line, which you remember is a straight angle, right? A straight angle is like this. That's 180 degrees, right? So imagine I had a point there, and we just made some sort of ray. Okay, well, if this is angle number one, right, and this is angle number two, since this is a straight angle, we know these add up to 180. Okay, now, similarly, if I had them separate, right, so um, say I had one like that, right, okay, and say I had one like that, right, if this one was 30 degrees and this one was 60, I'm sorry, if this one was 150 degrees, right, then we would say that that added up to 180. So if you has this or even like this, these are called supplementary angles. So what would we use? If we use part plus part equals 90 on this one we would do, that's right, part plus part equals 180. Okay, so that's the one that we were doing, that part plus part equals 180. All right, so now let's get to our last one. So this is also similar to a supplementary angle. Okay, so a linear pair are two angles that are adjacent and supplementary, and they form a straight line. Okay, so since they form a straight line, that's where we get that linear part of it. Okay, and then it says they're both adjacent and supplementary. Okay, supplementary, we just said, adds to 180, right? And adjacent, like we talked about right over here, adjacent means they share a side. They share a side. Okay, so a linear pair, if it's on a straight line, like we talked about, straight line, supplementary, and adjacent, sharing a side, that means it would be like this if I just did something like that and then I did that. So array. So they're on a straight line like we talked about. They're supplementary because we know they add up to 180 and they share a side. So any linear pair are supplementary angles, right? Just as you might thought. So those are one and number two. Okay, so on this one, what would it be? It would be part plus part equals 180, right? Part plus part equals 180. Okay, so now let's think about that, what we would highlight, to main thing to highlight these. So I think it's beneficial if we get out our highlighter and think about this. Okay, so vertical angles. We said on vertical angles, we're going to think part equals part, okay, because that's one on either side, okay. They're always going to be congruent. Then next, adjacent angles. We're going to think, for adjacent angles, we're going to think part plus part equals whole, okay, because we know this part plus this part equals the whole thing, right? Then on complementary, we're going to think that they add up to 90, okay, so complementaries are going to be part plus part equals 90. Okay, then supplementary. Okay, we're going to say that those add up to 180. Okay, so we're going to say supplementaries are part plus part equals 180. Okay, and then linear pairs, we're going to say that those add up to 180. So we're going to say part plus part equals 180 on that one as well. All right, so keep it moving on to our next page. Keep it in mind, let's think about this. All right, so what type of angles are number one and number two? So pause the video for a moment, see which one out of these. It might be more than one. All right, so hopefully you paused it, and let's take a look. This one is angle number one, right? And this one is angle number two. So if we're talking about what's the relationship between both of those, they're on opposite sides of each other, and they're as if I drew a straight line, right? So if you imagine that I had if I had two lines that crossed each other, okay, when I have two lines that cross each other, it's always going to make opposite angles that are called vertical angles, okay? So it's called vertical angles. All right, and we remember what's the formula for these? If they're across from each other, we're going to say that they're equal, right? So we're going to say part equals part. Okay, so that's our main thing we're going to focus on that, part equals part. All right, let's take a look at number two. Pause the video, see what you, actually, let's skip that one. Let's go to number three. Pause the video, see what you think about number three. Okay, what do we know about number one and number two? Number one and number two share this side in between, right? So if they share a side in between, because if that one's one, right, and that's one right there, right, and then if two is like this, that means if we do that, if we did that, that they would share this side, right? So we're going to say that those are adjacent angles, right? They are adjacent. Let's look. Are they vertical? No, they're not opposite each other. Are they complementary? No, they don't add up to 90. Are they supplementary? Let's look. This is a straight line, right? These two add to 180. So yes, those are supplementary. Okay. Are they a linear pair? Are they a pair of angles that make a straight line? That's a straight line. We have a ray there, so the answer is yes. Those are a linear pair as well. Okay, so what would we do for the formula for these? We would say part plus part equals 180. That's right. Part plus part equals 180. Okay, next, let's keep it moving. All right, what about this one? Pause the video, see what you think about this one. All right, so hopefully you recognize that we're talking about angles 1 and angle 2 right over here. Okay, so that being said, let's take a look. Um, they are opposite each other, right? Because if you imagine that if we um, had two lines, right, that cross just like that, right? These angles are opposite each other. So we're going to call those vertical angles, right? They are not adjacent because they do not share any sides. These are the two sides of one, these are two sides of two. They're not complementary because they don't add to 90. They're not we don't know if they add up to 180 and they're not a linear pair because they're not a straight line. All right, so what would we do if we're trying to solve for these? What would we say? The equation would be part equals part, right? Part equals part. One equals the other. All right, so hopefully that's making more sense. Let's take a look at this one. This one's a little trickier on number two. Okay, so angles one and two, right? We're talking about this one and this one, right? So this angle and this angle. Okay, so are they adjacent? Let's take a look, right? If we drew the sides, right, that's would be one and that would be two. They're sharing that side, right? So yes, they are adjacent. Okay, are they vertical? No, vertical angles means opposite each other, right? Complementary? Complementary means adds to 90, right? Well, what do we know? This whole thing adds to 180, right? If this much is 90, right, because of that, that means 180, right, minus 90 equals 90 for both of these, right? These add up to 90 degrees. Okay, so those are complementary as well. Okay, so that's how we figure that out. If the whole thing is 180, right? If this much is 90, 180 minus 90, the other part has to be equal to 90. So even though we don't see a box there, we know that we can add a box there, right? Because if this is 90 and this equals 180, this has to be 90. Okay, so what would we say on these two? What formula we would say? We'd say, that's right, part plus part equals 90. All right, next, let's look over here. What about these? 1 and 2 are, that's right, they're adjacent to each other, right? Because they share that side in between. Okay, are they vertical? No. Complementary? We don't know the measure of either because we don't see that. Supplementary, they don't make a straight line, they're not linear. Okay, and then our last one, 6. Okay, this is tricky. Pause this, see if you got this. Okay, so most of y'all probably got at least one of these. That's good. So this is more than one. This is 1 and 2, right? So we're talking about angles that are opposite each other, right? So if you imagine, like we said, if we said that we had a two lines that cross each other, right? These are opposite each other. So those are vertical angles, right? Vertical angles. Now, they also are supplementary. And you may be thinking, why are they supplementary? They add, because that means they add to 180. Well, let's check this out. This one is 90, right? If that one's 90, right? If we look at these two right here, these two have to add up to 180, right? Well, if this one's 90, that means this is 180 minus 90, which is equal to 90 as well, right? So this is also 90, so I can put a box there for that being 90, right? Well, then if this one and this one are opposite each other, that means they're equal as well, right? So that means that one's 90, and then if that one's 90, that means that one's 90. So they're all 90 degrees, okay? So if one is 90, that means the opposite is 90, and that means that has to be 90, that has to be 90. So those are supplementary. But they are not a linear pair because they don't form a line. All right, so that's the trickiest one on that. All right, let's keep it moving to our last page. All right, so I think you can get a lot of these on your own. I'm going to kind of push you. I want you to look at these first three right here and see if you can get these first three. These are all a little bit different. This is X compared to that 112. This is X, and we have 68, and we have X in 124. Pause the video for a moment, see if you can get those. All right, so hopefully you pushed yourself on that one. Let's check it out. On this one, we have this angle that's right here, this angle right here. Those are called vertical angles, right? So what do we know about vertical angles? That is part equals part, right? So if part equals part, that means X equals 112. Okay, good. Next, on this one, what do we know? This tells us that this is 90 degrees, right? So we know two angles that add up to 90 are called complementary, right? So complementary angles, we said um, we do part plus part equals 90, right? Part plus part equals 90. So that being said, if both of those add up to 90, that means I can do 90 minus 68, right? Which would give me 22 degrees for our answer, right? So our answer is X equals 22 degrees. Okay? X equals 22 degrees. Okay, next, number 3. Well, what do we know? We see this line right here, right? So we know these two add up to 180. So we're going to call those supplementary, right? Supplementary angles. Okay, what do we know about that? We know that part plus part equals how much? That's right, 180. So that means we would just do 180 minus 124, right? Because if they both add up to that, the opposite would be subtracting, right? So that means X equals 56 degrees, right? 56. Makes sense, right? Okay, let's keep it moving. 56 degrees. All right, so then, now that you got those, I want to push you. Let's go and highlight that. I want to push you to see what you think about this one. Okay, number 4. Okay, so pause the video for a moment. See if you can figure out how many of these, at least, that you can figure out. X, they want us to figure out what X is, Y, and Z. All right, well, here's how I would break it down. Hopefully you tried. First thing I know, I look at 43. I first try to look opposite, right? Opposite that is Y, right? So I know that those are vertical angles. Okay, so Y is going to be equal to 43 because it's a vertical angle, right? Now, what else do we know? Well, if that one's 43, right, and that's Y, we know that these two, right, have to add up to 180, right? Think about that. If I have a straight line like this, these two add to 180, right? They add to 180. So I can just do for X, I can say X plus 43 equals 180, right? So, of course, I would just subtract 43, and that would mean X equals 157 degrees, right? So, X is 157, Y is 43. Well, if X is 157, let's write that. If Y is 43, well, what else do we know? this and x and z are opposite each other, right? So if those are opposite each other, that's also 157 degrees. And that makes sense, right? Because y and z, those two are also linear pairs, and those should add up to 180, and they do. These two should add up to 180, and they do. These two should also add up to 180, and they do. So z is equal to 157. Okay. All right, so not as complicated, hopefully, once we talked about it. All right, now check this out. Pause the video, see if you can get this. This looks really complicated. Try it. All right, well, what do we know? First thing, I look for the numbers and I try to see opposite, right? We see that, right? So imagine if I had these two lines crossing right here. If this is 72, that means y is also equal to 72, right? So y is equal to 72 because it's a vertical angle. Okay, so then what do we know about um, this x and well, let's put it right here, right? If that's 72, I can think of it either way. This plus x equals 180, right? Or this plus x equals 180. So x is going to be equal to 180 minus 72, right? And that's going to be equal to 108. Okay, so x is going to be equal to 108. Y is going to be equal to 72. So if that's 108 degrees, what else do we know? Well, if this is 90, right, that means this whole thing right here, these two add up to 180 also, right? That tells us that's 90. So that means these two have to add up to 90 also, right? So that means z is equal to 90 minus 72, right? Z has to be equal to 90 minus 72, so that's 18 degrees. All right, so hopefully you followed all that. We just used logic to go from one to the other. Okay, nice. All right, so keeping that in mind, let's go ahead and skip these next ones and let's go down to 10. So we're going to skip these. Okay, so keeping those in mind, let's do some algebra. All right, so if PQT equals this, PQT, let's trace that out. Let's go and get our highlighter. Let's say PQT is that PQT. Let's go and write that in. That's going to be 3x plus 47, right? Okay, then SQR, SQR, SQR is that one, right? And it says that one is 6x minus 25. Okay, so they want us to solve for the measure of SQR. They want us to figure out what this is. Okay, well, SQR is represented by that, right? So that's 6x minus 25. So that means we need to find out what is x, right? So that we can substitute it in. Well, how do we do that? We need to make an equation involving x. Well, what do we know about this and this? These are both vertical angles, right? So what do we know with vertical angles? We know that is part equals part, right? So let's set it up and solve. We know this equals this, so let's set that up. We're going to say 3x plus 47 equals 6x minus 25. Okay, so since that's a true statement, if we get a true answer, then we'll substitute it in, right? So let's keep it moving. We're going to subtract 6x. Remember, we always try to move our variable first. So that gives us negative 3x plus 47 equals, cancels, negative 25, right? Then we're going to subtract 47, subtract 47. Okay, that is going to give us negative 3x. That cancels out. It's going to be equal to negative, what is that, 72, right? Okay, so then we're going to divide both sides by that negative 3. Okay, so that gives us x equals, negative divided by that negative can give us a positive 24, right? So if x equals 24, let's go ahead and put 24 into that, right? So then if we're going to say that 6 times 24, okay, we're just going to put that all into our calculator. Remember, we can just put that into our calculator right there, and that will give us the answer of 119, right? So that's our answer is 119. Okay, next. Otherwise, of course, we can do that times that minus 25. All right, keep it moving. What do you think about this one? It says AB is, this means perpendicular to CD. Now, we haven't fully talked about that, but perpendicular as it might look, that means that those are 90 degrees, right? This one right here is 90 degrees. So if DCE is 7x plus 2, DCE, okay, that's 7x plus 2. Okay, so I like to write on, you can remember, you can write right on your screen like that. Then ECB is x plus 8. ECB, okay, this other one right here is x plus 8. Find the measure of DCE. DCE. Okay, well, DCE is 7x plus 2, right? That means we need to figure out what x is, right? Once we figure out what x is, we're going to input that in, right? Because this means 7 times whatever number, and then we're going to add 2 to it. All right, so what do we know about those so we can set up an equation? Well, we know that those are complementary, right? Because they add to 90 degrees. So we're going to say part plus part equals 90, right? So let's say 7x plus 2 plus x plus 8 equals 90, right? So then we know we're just going to combine our like terms. We know that the next answer is what? 8x plus 10, right? Because that's a 1 right there. And we know that that's a 1x plus 7x gives us 8x. And then we know 2 plus 8 gives us 10. Good. All right, so 90, we're going to subtract 10. Subtract 10. Okay, so that gives us 8x equals 80. You probably already know what x is, right? If we divide both sides by that 8, okay, talking at the same time, that means x equals, the 8's cancel to make it 10, right? X equals 10. So then if x equals 10, we know what we're going to substitute in, right? We're going to substitute 10 right there. So once again, we can just put that into our calculator. But let's just do it by hand, right? 7 times 10 is 70, plus 7 gives us 77. That's our final answer. All right, now let's see if you can get this last one, at least set up on your own. Okay, KNM is 8x minus 5. KNM is 8x minus 5. Okay, M and J is that. M and J. M and J is 4x minus 19. 4x minus 19. Okay, now this is a little tricky, but what do we notice about that? I like it. I like drawing on here so we see these are both on the same side of this line. You may have to turn your paper the other way, but we should know that those are a supplementary, right? Supplementary. They're a linear pair, right? So they're supplementary. That means part plus part equals, that's right, 180, right? So if they want K and M, then we're going to say 8x minus 5, right? So that's 8 times some number, and then we're going to subtract 5 from it, right? So let's figure out what that is. So let's set it up. If we say part plus part equals 180, that means that we're going to say 8x minus 5 plus 4x minus 19 equals 180, right? So what are we going to pull down over here? For the x's, we're going to say 12x, right? Because we have 8x and plus 4x. All right, for the constant, we're going to say negative 24, right? Because we have negative 5 combined with negative 9. That's going to give us negative 24, right? So that equals 180. All right, now we know we're going to add 24 to both sides. Add 24 to both sides. Okay, so then it cancels out. 12x equals 204, right? Okay, so then we know that our last step is to divide. So we're just going to put that in our calculator, right? 204 divided by 12. It's going to give us the answer of, we have enough room here, right? X equals 17. Okay, now we're very close. So we just need to type that into our calculator, right? Remember, we can just type that in to our calculator just like that. And if we do that, we're going to get 131 as our answer. Okay, so that's the main thing that we need to remember is how are we dealing with this? Is it going to be part equals part equals part plus part equals 90, or part plus part equals 180? All right, let me practice with you. This is our last one before our test, so make sure you keep all your notes together.